RethinkX.com movement is really pretty interesting when you think of it from that perspective. And I would really like to kind of dig deep into it, into what that really means to rethink.
I would just, before we get into that, I did look
Sure.
at a little bit at their site. I think what we could do is like we usually do, like you could like try to introduce some of their stuff and me reacting to it. I think that could work out.
Okay.
But I would say first, like if you're the way this whole thing was prefaced with the utopianism and rethinking humanity, that's of course like there are many people. I think there would more likely be on the right, politically speaking, who think this is the horrific thing, that like you're trying to socially engineer people to be better somehow and like twist their nature. And there's a whole point of view that what you should be doing, and that's basically what conservatism is. You should be trying to realize who people are and always have been, and try to do the best you can with that, rather than try to in any way change people, especially radically, because that's a lot what's sort of proposed goals of things like communism as it was in practice, which was sort of terrible in practice, was that they were trying to forge a new man, and then like the new man will not be like envious, or with just everybody will be living in harmony with each other. And then we look at the methods by which they were changing man, and it was always, you know, horrific, like gulags, and also like wouldn't necessarily have to be wars, but it definitely involved a lot of like indoctrination, propaganda, and generally, you know, terrible perversions of normal political and social institutions. So there's a whole school of thought that's in fundamental opposition to anything like rethinking humanity. And I think the sort of valid point in that is, like I said, some of the utopias do have a problem in that they're very inhuman. Because if you're changing humans, then you might be changing them in a way or into something that's inhuman. And I guess we can agree that's not a great
No, and
thing to do.
yeah, like we've seen some of the books. Yuval Noah Harari writes the whole future of humankind. So he did the past of what mankind was, and then Homo Deus. Homo Deus is the name of his book. And there's another one, Humanity 3.0. I think Max Freiberger, that is just really about what humanity is going to become in the future, right? Whether we merge with androids. Elon Musk has talked a lot about that, becoming some kind of artificial human cyborg of some kind. And, so we kind of have to have that, at least in the back of our heads, is what direction do we want to choose if we had to choose our own evolution? But at the same time, what you're talking about is, conservative, almost Luddite mentality. The technology is happening whether we like it or not. We can all try to be Amish and, get rid of technology, get rid of progress. But whether we like it or not, we are getting this kind of exponential curve of progress in our technology. And that's where this whole
Yeah, I guess the
comes in.
point is, like you say, the Luddites are a good example. It's just that maybe what Luddites did, or something like the Amish, is too much. Like we can have more technology than that and be fine. But then, of course, I guess the question is there a level of technology that we should try to like cap progress at? Because more of it would be terrible.
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it possible for us to cap technology at the optimal level where we're still human, we're still alive in some form, we're still what we value as humans, and we haven't lost ourselves completely and turned into the Borg, right? And
usually in like the works of science fiction, in Dune, or in, I think, Warhammer 40K, there's a bunch of universes in which people had some sort of a terrible war with the AIs, and so from some point on they forbade the use of advanced AIs. I think is it Dune or Warhammer? I think it's in Warhammer, or it's in that, not sure which one, but one of them has sort of like a commandment, like thou shalt not make a machine in the image of human mind, or something like that. So maybe like some people could argue with the AI, some people would argue we should have done it with the nuclear thing, because there's some interesting historical background that's basically hearsay, but I think there's some validity to it. And that if people are interested in like what's alchemy, who were alchemists, what was alchemy about before modern chemistry, there allegedly were some self-proclaimed alchemists, even well into the 20th century. And I think it was one of the books I read that's a bit controversial. There was some sort of historical anecdote that one of the people who were early on sort of developing the nuclear science was approached by somebody who was from a position of like speaking as an alchemist, and they knew enough about the technology and its potential, sort of implying that there were some people who already knew the science of it, but kept it secret. So that for the reasoning of that, in sort of the alchemical historical tradition, is that it's quite possible that throughout history, many people have actually developed something relatively advanced technologically, at least the theoretical science of it, and knew where it's going potentially, and that it cannot possibly be left to the rulers, to the kings and stuff, because they would totally abuse it immediately. So they didn't tell anybody about it and made sure, or tried to make sure, that nobody is going to develop it as far as they have anything to say about it. And usually it would be something that's something into genetics or something that's into something nuclear. For instance, there's against all anecdotes, but something like that they allegedly were alchemists who could synthesize some sort of nuclear reaction in like makeshift conditions that technologically shouldn't have been advanced enough. Something like everybody's talking about cold fusion. It wouldn't be specifically cold fusion, I don't think, but something similar in that you have a reaction which should have some extreme conditions which you need to create to cause it, like philosopher's stone or sort of the idea that you can have substance that helps you transmute elements one into another. Now we know that you can do it using nuclear technology. It's just super expensive and difficult and stuff. But what if somebody, because alchemists as a method would be just trying to experiment sort of based on intuition and a lot of trying to force an accident, not proceeding from basic principles step by step, like the modern science does, but try to like skip a bunch of steps and randomly arrive at something that's like a catalyst, something that you cannot easily derive from basic principles. And then they've discovered the catalyst, which allowed to do something that was super advanced. So there was a whole school of thought that's now pretty much dead. Allegedly, there was a whole school of thought that maybe the reason why there wasn't a lot of technological advancement in a certain period might have been because the people who were advancing were keeping it secret because they have precisely opposite philosophy than modern scientists. So there's a whole argument of like, maybe we should do it with nuclear, maybe we should still really try to do it with genetics, and maybe the AI or the robotics, which was very explored in science fiction. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, you said a lot there. I think it's interesting to think of where that optimal level is on where we want to be, and then trying to think that we could actually hold it there, like the Amish have done, or like in some cases, some societies have done in the past. And it's definitely something we need to talk about. The Future of Humanity Institute is kind of talking about safe AI and how to move AI forward in a safe way. So those are all extremely important things that I think we're managing, and we're at least talking about it. The smart people know that it's a problem. We're talking about it, but I don't know if there's ever going to be a way that we can actually stop, people in power at some point from getting a hold of this technology. And I think we kind of need it because of climate change and because we've kind of hit our tipping point. We're hitting our tipping points here. And I think that's the difference now with 8 billion people in the world from any other point in human history, is that we're at a point now where we're all connected. We need to move from this age of extraction, dog eat dog, to the age of creation, where we're just creating more from less, and we're doing it in a cyclical, sustainable way, completely unlike anything we've ever done before, where we're just extracting resources, using them up, and throwing them out, and making our garbage dumps are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Our ocean plastic waste is a huge problem. Oceans are dying because of it. So we're hitting all these different tipping points. Materials, transportation, food, energy, information are kind of the 5 major areas that we're seeing kind of a confluence of ideas, or a confluence of technologies coming together, that can either lead us towards a huge higher level of evolution, or it can collapse us if we do it wrong.
Yeah, I guess if the core of the argument makes sense, which is that okay, if you were like an alchemist who discovered nuclear science in the 1700s or whatever, then you could conclude like, yeah, we don't need nuclear
Yeah,
power. At this point, we kind of do need nuclear power, so we kind of have to try it.
I think that's it.
Uh,
I
in
think
the sense of like even because there's a good example of the one that sort of the technology that really opened these issues was by Fritz Haber, I think with what's it called, with somebody from the industry. There's a process of capturing nitrogen from the atmosphere, which
mm,
allows to create synthetic fertilizer. And that by itself has made it possible to make like a 10 times larger population on planet Earth. So if there was a milestone technology, that was it. It wasn't any of the other ones. Now we just, since we can feed so many more people now, there's also the issue, okay, so how can we also provide them with heat or other forms of energy
yeah,
without burning up the whole planet, because you can't scale up the, like you said, the extraction based technologies. You can't scale them up in the same way as you can, for instance, the nuclear power, which literally is orders of magnitude more efficient power generation.
absolutely. Well, let's jump in from the ground up here. So we'll start our discussion. Rethink X. What is it all about? It's a whole website. Rethink X report. They've got a whole 90-page book on different reports. But I just wanted to kind of go through them one by one with you, Martin, and kind of get your take on it, and figure out exactly how we can kind of help with this transition. And the thing that's really interesting about their report is they don't have all the answers yet, and they make that very clear that they're not sure how this transition is going to happen. Nobody can know for sure, just like no one knows what the stock market's going to do tomorrow. If you did, you'd be a trillionaire overnight. But they do have some really good ideas on how we can kind of help have a good transition rather than a bad one. And I do think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's very clear in my mind that business as usual is not working. And we need some major transition, some major evolution or revolution, whatever you want to call it, to a new way of thinking. And conservatives don't like it. Like you said, Luddites don't like it. It's scary. You're afraid it's going to end your world. It takes the power away from people who are currently enjoying power. So I understand, the barriers to success. So people would rather just end the world than change the world in some cases, or they really think everything's okay as is. I'm fine. I don't see climate change. It's not a problem for me. Until it's too late, right? It is a
Yeah,
problem.
I'm one of the last few remaining people who are fine, so everything's fine.
Yeah, until the last tree is cut down and the last dollar is manufactured. The 1% are sitting in their ivory towers or in their fallout bunkers or whatever, thinking, "Oh, I'm totally fine. I've got 10-year supply of food. It'll last me until I die." City of Ember was an interesting one. I don't know if they were underground for hundreds and hundreds of years, and at some point they were supposed to go back to the surface before they ran out of materials, like it was a post-apocalyptic world. But the people underground they enjoyed it so much, they basically hid all the information or the pathways back to the planet's surface, because they were just so happy. And then eventually, of course, they did run out of food, and their energy machine eventually broke down. It was supposed to last 500 years, and they were trying to patch it together with duct tape, essentially, to keep it running for 1,000 years. But it was an interesting concept, and we are at that point. We are at the City of Ember right now, where our current system has so many tipping points that are just so ready to collapse. No matter what we do, we cannot go at business as usual. We can't slow down. We're going 1,000 miles an hour right towards the edge of a cliff, and if we don't somehow grow wings or somehow,
Well, I guess that's why not just the rich people, but also many of these sort of poorer, relatively conservative people are building the bunkers, because in their calculation, so yeah, everything's going down the drain, and there's definitely no way in which people can improve. Therefore, let's build a bunker.
yeah, I think that's a bit of a defeatist mentality in some ways, but I mean, more power to them. Hopefully, humanity does survive somehow, and the 1% to 5% of us will somehow survive
Oh
the
yeah,
apocalypse
that's
and
a
build
sort of
back better.
it's an interesting calculation. You probably every time want to have some Luddites and some bunker builders just in case.
Just in
So
case.
it's not a problem that somebody is doing it.
Yeah, I just don't see it as a major direction, for the vast majority of us. If the
Not
95 or
not plan
99% of
A,
us,
you say.
yeah, the plan A for the 99% of us should be something like this. where we're trying to grow wings, we're trying to take advantage of the technology we know is possible, we currently have it, and we're going to find ways to use it to kind of keep 99% of us, or as many as possible, still happy and still alive and still comfortable, with some kind of hope for the future. That's what the goal is in Rethinking Humanity, is about trying to give us hope for the future, so we don't get too depressed and angry and Luddite type. Let's just burn all the technologists and go back to living off farms, and 99% of the people be damned. So that's what this report is about. So let me.
I've sort of I skimmed it, and I also watched parts of their videos and stuff. It did remind me, especially the video, did remind me a little bit of Zeitgeist movies, which I don't think is a positive. It's a bit of like a cinematic from a sci-fi game. I'm not sure the vibe that they're giving off with it is exactly what they should be ideally going for. But in the document, of course, it's just a bunch of suggestions, that some of which are interesting suggestions. It's just a lot, and you kind of would have to have a pretty sophisticated debate about each of those specific points. So it's something that imagine either a lot of people is working on already, or you would require a lot of people to substantially figure out if what are actually the right calls to make in any of those like 50 million particular points, either like legal regulations or institutional things that you may wanna implement, or any other technologies to focus on. I don't necessarily, I did try to provide counter arguments, but I do not, of course, necessarily argue against the idea that people can do better. I wouldn't necessarily say it in a way that to make people better, that this sort of has the sort of scary overtones. I would say that people can do better, in that it's a bit of a, for me, it's a bit of a compromise between the conservative and the progressive point of view, in that, yeah, people have always behaved in particular ways. You could document the ways in which people have behaved, and you can document that they have some sort of a game theory pattern that is selfish or even self-destructive or short-sighted or whatever. But that's not necessarily speaking of the full human potential. For me, it's about trying to unlock the potential that the human species has always had. And the logic that I want to look at it as is more of an evolutionary adaptation logic. It's that humans have a capacity to adapt to many different worlds and scenarios. And if you just change the scenario by which you're operating in your mind, then the adaptation that you manifest, I mean, set of behaviors, can look different than the behaviors have looked previously when you were operating under a different mindset of all the possible mindsets that are still human and humans can have and always could have had. So I think it's just a more of a nuance of the utopians would always, like the sort of radical utopians would look at it oftentimes as to like, we need to do some sort of social engineering to force people to behave differently. And the conservatives, I think, again, radical conservatives, will, like, especially somebody to the extreme of Luddites or the Amish, would be looking at it as if like we can't do better. We can't possibly be able to handle something. I think human species has demonstrated, if you look at, for instance, like the works of literature, like the sort of imaginations of people, what they could be able to envision and therefore operate under. The human mind is very flexible, and I think it can adapt to a new paradigm, especially if the new paradigm has a lot of going for it in terms of you will have less negative things and you will have more positive things. If only you could accept new sort of rules by which we should operate. I think you can see in the world, not just that people everywhere are the same and always have been the same. I think you can see more of a sort of like a world functioning as a museum of everything that has happened or appeared throughout history as a way that people operate under, that always somewhere, like some vestige of all of these ideas always exists. Like you do have the Amish somewhere, you do have slavery somewhere still, you do have some super progressive people who really are completely tolerating like people who are different than them and function fine in their community with not like any significant crime, or real prejudices that they have to sort of just like be pretending that they don't have. It's just like legitimately communities of people that have sort of moved on away from tribalism. They just exist, they live, they function. You can see it as, for instance, with the refugees. I think there was an interesting analysis lately. It was in the United States. I think the Florida governor did some stunt where he moved some, I'm not sure from where they were specifically, maybe from somewhere from South America or Mexico, some migrants or refugees, and he specifically landed them with wrong instructions so that they definitely fail, and they landed them in some sort of like a high society community in a state that's that declares to be progressive, or that is sort of welcoming them. And the issue was that the sort of radicals who concocted this scenario thought that they will embarrass the progressives who proclaim that they would want to like invite them, the migrants, with open arms, because when they arrive at their doorstep, they would definitely refuse them and send them away, or start saying how they're terrible or whatever, because the radicals in that scenario weren't able to imagine that there could be people who have a legitimately different mindset and actually mean it when they say that those people are welcome. Because, and you can even have like pragmatic arguments, because they've calculated that those people don't actually commit crime. Like the first generation immigrants don't really commit crime, because they're under more like a watchful eye of the society than most other people probably. So they're not a problem in that way, as neighbors. They're also a cheap source of labor that can do all the jobs that the local people wouldn't want to do. And then they have also like the demographic thing, that maybe some places the population is facing demographic collapse and sort of needs sort of a young blood, like needs like young people from somewhere to revitalize the community. You can have million pragmatic, rational arguments for that. And there are some communities who either pragmatically or just, you know, philosophically, humanistically, like has really moved on and is really fine with it. And it's just, the issue is that the people at the other extreme side of the idea spectrum really genuinely can't imagine that there could be a person who would genuinely have a different point of view, and therefore like be a different human being,
Mm.
but they demonstrably do exist. So I think,
Okay.
just to sum up super quickly,
Mm.
I think it's about potential. I think it's about unlocking real potential that has always existed. So not making people into something they never were, but discovering the ways in which people have genuine internal potential to become better.
Okay, I like that. I think for me, it's really just about hope. It's really just about trying to look forward to the future in a way that, yeah, that's exciting. You know, it makes you want to get up in the morning, like Elon Musk always likes to say. You got to have something exciting to look forward to. That, you know, the future is not going to just end in Armageddon necessarily. Like we don't have to die like sooner than we want to. You know, and I think that's the scary thing. We've seen the rises and falls of so many civilizations, and it talks about that quite a bit, as well as, you know, all the Sumerians and the Roman Empire and the Egyptian Empire, and you know, and the Dark Ages that typically follow them. You know, we had a 1,000-year medieval period that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, essentially. You know, and we can finally have the ability to learn from these mistakes with the printing press and the age of oil and the age of um, in the industry age, industrial age, extracting all this stuff. And now with the information age kind of taking off, uniting the entire world for the first time in history with the internet, we actually have the ability to learn from history more than ever before. And the ability for our leaders to understand, you know, what went wrong with these past civilizations, and how to see that the same thing is happening right now in our industrial age with the age of extraction. We're running out of resources, just like all the great civilizations before us. We're running out of climate to pollute, to throw our waste. And it's really, really clear for anyone with a critical scientific mind to look at it. The problems are so clear. And we actually, for the first time in history, have good solutions, not just more of the sacrifice more people to our gods, or more of the you know, just keep on digging up more trees, they'll grow back or something. We actually have the knowledge to understand the water cycle and the earth cycle. We can test things on such a more minute level today than any civilization before us, and we can scientifically reason and teach other people that this is what we need to do to not not
No,
fail.
I would say that like I sort of there's definitely big truth in what you said, but also some misconception. The misconception I think is a bit historical. First of all, yeah, all the empires have fallen, but humanity is still here. So even if you had a nuclear Armageddon or something like that, of course it's a terrible thing, and everybody should be working to so that it never happens. But even in the universe of Star Trek, that actually happened. World War III in that universe happened and was nuclear, and some big proportion of population died. And there was, like you say, a dark age, so a period of sort of chaos and disorganization. But I think that it's incredibly difficult. Like Isaac Arthur always says, it's very difficult to completely eradicate, destroy tool using intelligent species. It's incredibly difficult. So of course it would be a major setback. But if you look at it, many empires have fallen, and with each of them there was some level of technological progress, and then of course some of the technologies were forgotten and lost and had to be rediscovered. But overall there was an arc of improvement, because there's another thing that Isaac Arthur keeps saying, is that once there's evidence of pre-existing advanced technology of a specific kind, it's much easier to reinvent it than to invent it in the first place.
Yeah.
So just the evidence of things that used to exist may accelerate the sort of reinvention and return to the same technological level, because again, people are smart enough to understand, even if they're not explicitly taught by their, I don't know, parents or teachers, they're able to understand if they some like centuries in the future would find a nuclear missile or something, they would eventually figure out missiles and the nuclear energy or nuclear physics much faster than it took us the first time around. So there's like
Right.
the reason about history is that it's, and also if you like the Middle Ages in Europe particularly are called the Dark Ages. And I notice I said in Europe because it wasn't dark in other parts of the world at the same time. So if you look at it globally, it wasn't a dark age. And after like the Romans collapsed, that's one thing. Another thing is that it wasn't all that dark anyway. There was a lot of technological inventions born out of necessity oftentimes. Like I think they, in that medieval period, printing press. Printing press is a product of the medieval period ultimately, and
Right.
that's a pretty advanced technology with significant impact. So just like, I think, just to sum up, I think you're right in that we do now have more of a scientific technological understanding than anybody before, so that we can definitely learn from history and learn not to make the same mistakes, and just fix the things.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, the whole thing is a history of progress, pretty much. There isn't anything like a complete reversal at any point in
Yeah,
history globally.
absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't completely annihilate, every bipedal human in the world. If we tried hard enough, we probably could make a nuclear winter big enough and powerful enough to wipe out all humanity. It's possible. It's definitely not out of the realm of possibility that we have the ability to do that with some kind of gray goo, or even just launching every nuke at the same time.
Well,
Um,
oh, okay. So just to clarify, like you said, if we like really tried, it's just that's not a thing that usually gets really tried for.
no,
Is
you're
like
right.
the
You're right.
reason why, like, people, even like, you can just have, I don't know, swords or something, and if you really try, you can kill every last human.
No, but anyway, I agree with what you're saying. But the point is of this discussion today, and the whole saving the world together movement is really about trying to avoid that collapse. It might happen, and maybe we'll come back stronger in a Star Trek like society. Maybe we can't avoid the collapse, but I would like to believe that we can. And I would like to believe that we can avoid the worst of it anyway, the worst of Armageddon, and somehow kind of sneak through, sneak through to a new age of creation, a new age of prosperity without losing 99% of the population or more.
Well,
And
like in a like nuclear Armageddon, we could talk about like third or a half. Like the 99% really isn't even like on paper, because I just like sum it
yeah,
up
for
real
sure.
quick.
Okay.
Well, but just the science of it is like game theory, military, nuclear warfare wise, is that if somebody tries to start a nuclear war, and if it got to a point that everybody made at the highest level the decisions to fire everything at everyone, then first of all, you would have sort of preset targets. Like, it's one of those jokes is like, why would you, if you're like, okay, Russia or United States, why would anybody nuke Australia in particular?
Yeah.
as like the whole continent. Like that you want to oversaturate the defenses of the thing that you actually want to destroy. So it was like a sort of a meme joke that like was like a so nuclear World War III happened, and it was like just Australia watching the nukes flying from one side to the other.
Uh,
And if like all of Australia survived, then civilization survived. But that's one thing. Another
yeah,
thing
sure.
is that if somebody gives the order to fire it, then somebody actually a bunch of other people have to follow the order. And if they okay, so some of them not 100%. 100% history suggests not 100% of them would follow the order.
Mm.
So some did. So some would follow the order and would try to fire the nukes. Some of the percentage of the nukes, they're very old technology and have not been necessarily maintained properly. And you need to have the huge floppy disk to insert into the
I
machine to
get it. I
fire
get
them.
it. Yeah,
So
I
a
hear you.
bunch of them would fail to launch. Of those that launch, some of them would, of course, be like, I guess, to compensate for all these things. Some of them would be ICBMs, which have multiple warheads or something. But that's a minority of the super best, most advanced is not all of the arsenal, not the majority of the arsenal.
Okay.
So some of those who would fail to launch, some of those who launch would fail to fly to the target or hit the target. Some of those who would even theoretically would hit the target would be intercepted in some way because there are some ways to intercept rockets. So you would shoot down some of those, and of those who would fall, some of them would still fail to detonate. Even like that would because there were historical cases of there was this plane in America. The nuclear warhead fall out of the plane, or the plane crashed
Mm.
with the warhead, and the warhead could have detonated under those conditions, but somehow didn't. So that's why America still has one of both Carolinas.
Okay. Well,
So that's it's just like to do this whole calculation. It's just
yeah.
it's not as simple as on paper that all the countries have like enough nukes to wipe out the Earth 10 times. Like you need
No,
to
I hear you. I
subtract
hear you.
a lot of different.
And it's debatable whether the nuclear winter, how bad it would be, how long it would last. Whether it's 50%, 90%, 99%. Well, what's important is that it would change the life of everyone on Earth very
Sure.
significantly. Let's just say that, and it would, in many ways, make everyone's life that didn't die, that did survive, significantly worse,
Sure.
significantly worse. And so let's just say that that's what we're trying to kind of avoid.
No, to be
Just to
clear,
make it clear.
I'm not arguing against it being like
That's good.
bad,
So,
that we should avoid it. Of course,
yeah.
it's very bad and we should avoid it. I'm just
Anyway,
saying, I'm only pushing back against the sort of absolutist 100%
yeah,
presentations
I hear
of
that.
the scenario in the
I hear
future.
that. So let me so to be clear, this whole rethink movement that I think goes in line very well with our Saving the World Together movement is really just about getting people to think about solutions and kind of be hopeful of those solutions and not try to hold them back. Don't, because I think the Luddite mentality, I think the Amish mentality, even though it kind of worked for them in some ways, even the whole conservative mentality, 50% of the conservative people in the US, it might work for them in some ways. But I feel pretty strongly that that mentality is probably going to push us like off a cliff like lemmings if we don't figure out a way to kind of merge it with kind of a new way of thinking somehow. And I'm not saying that it's just right or left. I try to be
Also,
sensible.
another misconception, lemmings don't just jump off cliffs.
They
There's a
don't. They don't.
whole myth thing.
You're right. That's a myth, but it's still a usable
Not even
analogy.
lemmings do it.
Yeah. But anyway, the point is that we got to take all this research, all this actual facts of the technology that's available, and figure out ways to use it to try to avoid this Armageddon apocalypse scenario as best as we can, and try to have hope that maybe we can get through it, so that we don't kind of build bunkers, or we don't feel a need to build bunkers as much, or waste as much of our human resources building bunkers, because we have hope that there's another way of getting the majority of us, if not all of us, the vast majority of us, through this let's just say complicated time of humanity, and
No, I think
rethinking
like the more you think about bunker building, I guess you can just strictly see it as a wasted time and effort and resource because okay, so the worst scenario comes, and you think that some of the people would just survive in those bunkers. Like if it truly was the worst case scenario, then just you survive for a while in some bunkers. It's not going to really solve anything. If it was like truly the worst possible level of the scenario, so
Okay.
maybe like they have like a shelter from bombing in every major city. Sure, that makes sense. But ultimately, you could I guess watch it as a wasted effort. And instead, if the people focused on trying to do literally anything else, then they would also be much more invested in really trying to make sure that the worst doesn't come. because if you think you have a fallback option, if you have a plan B, the B being bunker, then
Exactly.
maybe you don't try as hard to
No,
help stop the decline or of everything else.
that's absolutely right. And we want the 1%. They're the ones we need the most. The ones that have the potential to build bunkers. We need their help to get us through this transitionary period, whatever it ends up being. So let me just go through the technologies, because I am really excited about some of these technologies. Some of them are pretty new to me even, and I've been studying for 20 years, these kinds of things. And I think they're very exciting. I think we're in the decade, 2020, 2030. This is the decade when these kind of world-changing technologies, I think, will come about one way or the other. There's dozens of companies working on each of these things now, and every year they're kind of solving key critical problems to kind of new ways of thinking, new ways of solving these problems. So let me just go through each of them really quick. You can offer your feedback or ideas on what you think about each of these technologies, but I'm pretty excited about most of them. So there's the 5 areas: transportation, materials, information, food, and energy. These are the 5 main areas that kind of humanity needs to prosper, let's just say, to be happy, to have a certain amount of travel each day, a certain amount of healthy food each day, a certain amount of information, entertainment, and purpose. Let's just say a job of some kind each day. And then, having the materials to build shelter and clothing and all these other good things, materials. And then what was the last one? Food, energy, and energy, the energy to do it all. So let me just talk about, they read a whole report on how each of these things is really transformative. So the main one, food, I think is probably, if we don't eat, we die. That's the key resource that 10 billion people in the world in 2050 will probably need if we keep going.
Well, arguably, water would be above food, but that's also because you need water to grow it.
We'll group water and food together. They're the nutrients to the body. But you're right, clean water is a huge part of getting healthy, nutritious food as well. So they go hand in hand. But the big technology here they're talking about is precision fermentation. And it's come a long way in 30 years. We used it to make beer. We use it to, with yeast and all these other kinds of breads that we've been fermenting for years. But all of a sudden, with all the nanotechnology and DNA technology that we've been evolving in the last couple of decades, it's at a point right now where it's finally cost competitive to create just about any kind of food you can imagine, whether it's meat substitutes, maybe even bacon, who knows, whatever kind of food that you like. It is now possible, within the next couple of years, to create that food in a huge vat. You just make the amoebas or the proteins or the molecules, just like yeast, with whatever characteristics you want. You can kind of DNA code them, and then it just goes, you just feed it whatever kind of feedstock, grass or whatever, and then you just feed it with energy, feed it with nutrients of whatever kind, and they just completely multiply. And then at the end of the day, you take out the water, you put them together in some kind of protein or powder, and you cook them or 3D print them into whatever kind of food you want. And it's just really, really interesting technology. And the more I think about it, the more it just makes sense that
it's kind of basically real world replicators. You can't have any more real food replicators than this.
It's exactly what it is. And I had no idea it was this far along, that there's actually dozens of companies right now, making eggs, precision fermentation eggs from the DNA of chickens. They're just, and we see 2 of the biggest companies right now, Impossible Meats and Beyond Beef. They're starting to do a lot of this kind of stuff to make meat from, pea protein and create, and then Memphis Meats was, I think it's now Impossible Foods is the name they changed to, where they're basically just growing meat in petri dishes of various kinds, and eventually they'll grow it in vats. And it's kind of disgusting. People kind of have the, ooh, I don't want to eat food like that effect. And I get that. It makes sense. No one wants to eat, necessarily disgusting types of food that is grown in a vat. It makes you kind of cringe. But
it's also a bit of a dilemma for vegans, because it's meat, but it's completely guilt-free.
It's guilt-free meat.
I'm not sure how they will respond to that.
Yeah, and then that's the idea with all of this type of precision fermentation is we're basically growing. You can do it with agriculture. It doesn't have to be meat. You're growing protein. You're growing the basic building blocks of life. You're just growing them in a big test tube.
Yeah, I think there's also I think the main component of this approach is efficiency. That you can just use as little resources to produce as much of the outcome
So it's a
I think that's the biggest part. Like the
that's a big part.
right now, I think the reason why Malthusian arguments have failed so far, that if you get too much people, people will start to starve and you just won't be able to feed them. I
Right.
think they so far mainly failed because there was always a way to technologically switch up the order of magnitude of yield that you can
Yeah.
get from the same amount of stuff. And I think like one of the bottlenecks, like I said, was the fertilizer, so the nitrogen from the need to get it from somewhere. It was very difficult to get it from air, but there's a bunch of it in air, so it's not an issue if
Yeah.
you can crack it, and it was cracked. Right now, I think it's either that, or I think like in Israel, it feels like more of a desert condition places, they're sort of learning to like precision dose the water
Hmm.
when they're watering the crops. So and then that you can really get an order of magnitude yield improvement
Yeah.
or less resource that you need to use from that.
So let's just assume for now that all these things are working, and I think they are. They're working very well. There's companies that are selling their product right now, and it's just economies of scale. It gets cheaper and cheaper, and within the next couple of years, you'll be able to buy, an Impossible Burger for a tenth the price of an actual cow burger, and it'll taste the same and probably be healthier and better for you. So it's really
Yeah,
super
but still,
exciting.
because there's additional, there's like all the reasons, like you wouldn't involve antibiotics that you need to pump into the livestock, and
Yeah,
that wouldn't be breeding new bacteria in the places where you concentrate a lot of the livestock next to each other. I think there's sort of an interesting ethical dilemma there, because this is the way how you can produce things that people want to eat, because I think that's one of the aspects where you can't change all people to not want to eat meat. And I think that's
yeah,
too hardwired biologically. I think people have argument there, the conservatives. But at the same time, okay, so the only reason why there are many of those animals alive in the first place is that we're growing them for food. If we don't need to not grow, but I guess breed, if we don't need to breed them for food, we don't need to have them around. So that would basically end up in sort of like a almost a permanent like holocaust of the species, like whole species, because like you only get the benefit that you're proclaiming you're going to get, like decreased suffering of the animals and the economic efficiencies and stuff, if you cancel all the breeding operations, if you
yep.
just stop having them around. So
Well,
it's sort of like a okay, so they can exist and suffer to be eaten, or the option is like they wouldn't exist and not suffer, because of course if you don't exist you don't suffer.
yeah.
So I think that's sort of an interesting ethical argument in there somewhere.
There is, but I think the bottom line is that this is happening, whether we like it or not. It's getting cheaper. The end result here for humanity to think about is eventually within probably the next decade, maybe less, the agricultural industry and the cattle industry will probably start to fail because it's cheaper and better in almost every way. 100 times less water, 100 times less energy. 100 times less water and land go into
No, I think
making
like
those
that's the
fermentation
one
foods.
way in which I think capitalism undeniably works,
Right, right, and so
because
that's
it's great at increasing efficiencies. And
yeah,
if you decide to be ethical about it, then you can specifically maximize even some ethical dimension, or just factor it in like, okay, I could be either maximizing the efficiency of breeding cattle, or I can calculate that what's actually more efficient is if I don't do that at all and instead synthesize the food,
yeah,
then just capitalistic logic takes over. And yeah, that's 100% going to work.
yeah. So the only
If
real
the science is
barrier,
sound. The
yeah,
only problem there is if the science isn't sound. But I think in this
sure.
case, the
I,
science of this is sound.
I'm pretty confident that the science, I mean, definitely parts of it are very sound, and it's getting better and better every year. They're answering all those questions. They're getting more varieties of foods. They can grow just about anything, and they're getting better and better at it. So anyway, let's just assume for now that it will continue to progress at a similar rate, if not even faster. And that's going to, the only thing that holds it back then is basically subsidies that the government just doesn't want to let the cattle industry die, and they keep on giving more and more money to the farmers to compete with the PF foods. It's called PF, precision fermentation foods. So the PF foods will have to do better and better to compete with subsidized beef, and because the PF foods aren't subsidized at all. So I think that's something that could be a very big problem because people don't want to give up their normal ways of
Well,
making
I
meat.
think there will still remain an industry of sort of these like what's called organic foods.
Yeah,
Like you might, I think one of the better outcomes of the situation would be if you really got rid of the sort of big, with terrible conditions for the animals, sort of big operations,
Yeah.
And because all of those people with the big money would realize that the bigger money is in this,
Yeah.
not for any ethical reasons, but they would just calculate this is better a bang for the buck. But then you would still have people on the market who just want to have actual normal organic food. That's the conservatives. It
Yeah.
would just be way more expensive. So it's like if you wanted it, it would be understood. Like now, but organic foods even now for no like sometimes for no good reason are way more expensive. It just would be a good reason why they
Yeah.
are. And then I think it might result in a culture of okay, so the only thing that will left would be like small local farms where the animals are treated right or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you have like you could arrive, I think, quite organically, to use a pun, in this sense, at the situation which is actually sort of ethical and economic best case scenario. I don't think you will ever not have any normally grown animals to eat
No.
for no reason because I think
Always
there
be
will
fun.
be market demand for
Yeah.
that for ideological reasons, you could say.
There'll be hobby farms and stuff. People just enjoy doing it, and there'll always be kind of a hobby mentality, and that's great. The point is that I just don't think as a society we should subsidize it anymore. We already subsidize it heavily. The dairy industry would have failed many years ago if we weren't throwing so much government subsidies into it. So I think if we just start transitioning our thought process to maybe even subsidize the PF stuff to compete with the current, dirty stuff, at least to some extent, and then just slowly but surely move the subsidies over,
Yeah, because like
and try to
ultimately
find people.
what you want there to destroy probably most cause you have to want to destroy are the sort of big terrible breeding operations. I think
Exactly.
that that's something that
Factory farms.
most people would be glad if it stopped
Yeah.
existing.
So that's food, and I don't want to dig too deep. I'll let everybody who's watching this kind of dig deeper on their own. But I personally am very excited about PF foods. I think it's just one of the greatest things that I've read about in the last year, and it's taking off. And I'd say support it any way you can. Vote for people who are getting rid of subsidies on old dirty foods. Let's just call them dirty foods, and then kind of clean, new age, new society foods of various kinds that are much healthier, much better, will give us longer life and better life than any of these old dirty industries, factory type
But I think
farms.
like is it supposed to be more efficient than normally grown like for vegetables
Even
than
that,
normally grown
yeah,
vegetables?
even
Even
better
that.
than vegetables. Yeah, even better than vegetables. It's about 10 times better than vegetables, 100 times better than meat as far as land and water use.
Mm.
So even vegetable farms,
Mm.
agriculture, the idea is long term, within 10 to 15, 20 years, we're going to convert close to half of our agricultural land back to natural lands,
Mm.
so that the kind of the trees grown can suck back in the climate, and the
Yeah,
climate can
I
start
did that
to
definitely is a great synergy with helping the climate
yeah.
on scale. That's because
So
you then can let go of the agricultural
yeah,
lands and reforest them, which is also part of the solving the other problem. So
exactly.
yeah, because
So,
I sort of I'm failing to see any downsides to this that aren't completely made up. I think that there could only be an issue of like if it's like not as like health wise safe to eat, but if it's ultimately really the same molecules, then I don't think
yeah,
there
it really
really
is.
is any difference unless you're some sort of animist and you think that like what makes the food edible is the spirits of the animals or whatever. I don't think you can
Yeah,
there would be a whole different level of science. It would be sort of ironic if you like it's a good sci-fi plot. If you like did this and then you realized after a while that you've screwed up because
yeah,
there's actually some sort of like a vital force that has to be in a living thing. But that's complete, of course,
yeah. So
fiction.
you can
That's
you I can
not
guarantee
real.
there's going to be Luddites kind of throwing out the fake news against them, saying, "Oh, it's toxic. If you eat this for years,
Well,
you're going to die." And
much like with GMOs, that's just
much
like
like with GMOs.
hating GMOs in principle.
Yeah. So like, and we'll leave it at that for now. I just really wanted to get it out there that I think this is exciting, and it's just if we can think of a world with unlimited amounts of food produced in a good, sustainable way, that's still obviously safe to eat and good and healthier than the current options, and it's available anywhere in the world. You can build it in cities. You can build it anywhere you need to. We can build cities in the Arctic underground if we wanted to, and grow all the food on site.
Yeah, we can
Um,
also use less land because you could scale these operations vertically
you could, or even underground.
easily.
You could have easily 1 trillion people fed on Earth with this technology if you perfect it. And so that's one of the five. We'll dig deeper. We can circle back, but I'm excited about that.
Mhm.
Energy is a big one. We'll just touch on it because we've talked a lot about it in past videos, but their personal favorites in their report are solar, wind, and batteries, and then the exponential curve, they're getting cheaper and cheaper. The only real
Just to be clear, you meant solar and or wind, not solar wind.
Yeah, solar and wind and batteries. It's SWB. Are there? Is
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
their
yeah,
acronym?
because solar just it's just nitpicking. Solar wind
No,
is
you're
a
right. You're
real
right.
thing that exists that you could also generate some power using if you had infrastructure in space.
Yeah. The
So there's
bottom line
quite
is just
space solar, I guess.
you're getting energy from the sun. All our energy, even wind, comes from the sun. Gravity comes from the water. Hydros comes from the sun. It just melts. So at the end of the day, it's just about converting
Yeah,
energy
it's
in the most efficient way. The
well,
only real
technically,
problem
even in the oil, it's a concentrated energy from the
it
sun,
is,
so
yeah,
it's all
it's
solar.
all solar. Everything's solar, except
Yeah, even
nuclear, I guess.
nuclear, because of course, sun is a nuclear fusion reactor.
Yeah, exactly. It starts. So then I guess you could say it's all nuclear before solar.
Yeah,
Nuclear
okay,
starts.
that's maybe more fundamental point because
But
everything
anyway,
is atom.
the point is that we have the ability to create solar panels, using robots, using nanotechnology, using all these new,
Well,
materials. Materials is another one of the five that's
well,
keeping
okay, so to just
solar and
maybe
wind.
very quickly interject, I would interject in that
Yeah.
because I've heard a lot of criticism of solar. Like one way of criticizing it in general is that you need the rare materials. That's true for batteries
Yep.
also.
Yes.
That's what the actual one of the actual problems is, that the limitations in like lithium reserves or like sort of
No.
rare earths, not the other materials that come
Absolutely.
into
And
it.
I was going to touch on that. Actually, I was just saying that exact
Mhm.
same point. So that is the key issue. But the thing that's really interesting in the report is that we're very, very close to solving that in a way where we can create those materials in new ways, where we can create batteries using like
Without no,
carbon
but
nano.
batteries without lithium, I have definitely
Yeah.
heard that there are potential ways to do
There's,
batteries without lithium. It's just the downside is that lithium, the technology with lithium allows you higher concentrations of energy, but you don't necessarily need the most densely packed concentration of energy in the battery. If it's like for residential purposes, then you can have it could be bigger. The battery doesn't have to be as dense, and then you
yeah.
can use different materials.
Well, the point is that their nanomaterials are progressing so fast. Carbon nanotubes, all these different kinds of new
That's
materials
another, yeah.
that they're essentially making just from carbon. They're pulling carbon out of the air and making carbon nanotubes or bioplastics or a variety of materials. That's the fifth one, is materials. So you're using these materials to
Yeah,
build the
but
solar,
don't
wind
you get
energy.
most carbon from oil?
You can convert oil to solar panels. There's various ways of taking atoms. So basically, instead of taking the oil and burning it, which is what we've done in the past, the
Mhm.
extraction, we're taking the oil and materials and creating new materials from the ground up, replicator style, and building solar panels from atoms. Essentially, at the end of the day, you're
That would be
taking.
that'd be really funny if you made solar panels out of oil. That would be like really really
Well,
funny.
there's a lot of oil that goes into making a solar panel, one way or the other. The materials go together. They make
Mm.
plastics. They make
Correct.
a variety of things. But the point is that there's no barrier. There's no physical barrier there to creating wind and solar 100%, cheaply, efficiently, sustainably, in a way
But
that'll
then
break down after its
sure,
use.
sure.
And
But
you
then
will
there's
use.
the issue that these sources of power aren't constant, so they're not good for base load of
That's
the.
where you
That's
need the
the other
batteries.
consideration.
Yeah, so that's the three together: solar, wind,
Batteries,
and
of course. Yeah,
batteries.
yeah.
And if you can again do batteries in a huge way where it's super cheap to make, tons of them, put them underground, and when their end of life comes, you pull them up, recycle them, make new batteries out of them. And the same companies are reusing the same materials over and over again. They're recycling them. They're accountable for them, so they produce them in the right way that
Mhm.
makes them easy to recycle because they're accountable for recycling them at the end of life.
Yeah,
Um,
of course. Recycling overall, if you can pull it off, is a great way to increase efficiencies of the whole of
yeah,
processes. It's just I feel like this was criticism of recycling was that a lot of the plastics in particular can't really be recycled because those are
right,
complex molecules. You
exactly.
can recycle elements. If it's for instance aluminum or something like that, you can very easily resmelt it and
Yeah.
use it again.
I mean, ideally, if you use solar energy in some kind of arc reactor or some kind of, what do you call it? Right now in Sault Ste. Marie, we've got a steel electric arc furnace that we're just putting in. We're replacing our old, blast iron, natural gas, essentially blast furnace. And it's just going to be all electricity, and it's all powered by wind and sun. So that electricity in that furnace is going to melt iron ore and steel and scrap steel completely together, and you're going to make brand new steel out of it. It's like 90% efficient as far as recycling. And we can do very similar things with solar panels and wind farms and wind towers eventually.
Sure.
Right now
I
it
did like,
hasn't
of
been
course, it's
built
like
with that in mind.
assuming the technological solutions are behind the corner, like just ahead in the development, then sure. I think the main
Yeah.
criticism from like more conservative or let's say biased toward oil and lobby and stuff people, the main argument is like we don't actually have the technologies and we will not be able to have those technologies to make it work.
Yeah.
And but if you can have a battery without lithium, which I know there's definitely being developed, like there are ways to solve that if there's enough
Right.
interest. And if you can have a solar panel that's also doesn't require such rare things, but also is because there's the other issues like, okay, so you make it, and in order for it to be carbon neutral or better, it has to be like functioning for X amount of time. It's like longevity of the technology is like another issue. Other than because usually people focus very much on efficiencies only and like theoretical efficiencies, not actual accomplishable efficiencies. But if you look at what's the real problem in the whole equation, then it would be more the things that are not obvious necessarily, and that's usually a lot an issue in material science. So it's like assuming that you can solve the material science bottlenecks,
Yeah.
then
And
for sure there's definitely enough solar energy overall hitting the planet to make it work somehow.
exactly. And so that's what their report is focused on, the numbers, how solar is getting cheaper and cheaper, oil is getting more and more expensive. It's just, and we've hit that
Oh,
point.
not to mention you can always in the meantime use nuclear.
Yes, and nuclear's, they don't mention nuclear too much, but they talk about it a little bit. And there's also the possibility of cold fusion that we've talked about many times before. That I think there's 23 companies in the world today with 100 million in funding or more working on fusion still, and it's very, very close. I'm
Well,
always
yes,
hopeful. I'm always
although I have
hopeful.
seen some, I intentionally watched some skeptical videos regarding that, and
Yeah,
some of those are probably scams
I'm sure.
because some
Yeah,
of those don't really go into great explanation, and a lot of those focus on like we can make the fusion going, but that's not the hard problem. The
yeah,
hard problem isn't to make the fusion going. The hard problem is to overall get enough energy. And in some of the presentations, I think somebody was pointing out that they sometimes focus on only a part of all the energy that's actually required, and they were showing that some part of the process was producing more
yeah,
energy than other part of the process required, but wasn't factoring in every other energy
yeah.
input in the whole system. So the point of that skeptic was that it's definitely not here in 20 years.
No,
Like likely if and one of these pans out, then you're thinking 50 years maybe.
yeah, I would definitely won't hold my breath for it. I can still be hopeful and excited for it, but the solar, wind, and batteries are here now, and within the next 10 years, we could scale them up to the point where we could get 50%, 80%, 100% of our energy from just these three things if we wanted to. If we made it like a worldwide effort and we did it in a responsible way, a recyclable way, a sustainable way, and we focused on the materials technology that are there today and continue to improve them, we can do it. It's definitely a possibility. And
No,
again, the
there
only real
definitely was
barrier,
already even the people who were sort of doing lately reviews of how this whole situation is going had somewhat optimistic reviews in that there's already a lot been done in converting the grids and the sources of power and advancing some of these technologies.
our factories are, our gigafactories are building. You know, we're building more and more every year. It's exponential. You know, it was 1% for a while, or sorry, 0.1% for many, many years, like a decade, and then like 0.2, 0.4. Right now we're sitting at, you know, 30, 40% renewable energy. It's the same where I am. It's 99% renewable already. We get a hydro, wind, and solar, 100% of our energy, plus this big electric arc furnace.
I think there was one other criticism that in these calculations, people would include things like burning biofuels and stuff, but that oftentimes those wouldn't be particularly great, like clean
Yeah, it
in
depends.
terms of CO2.
For biofuels, it has to be coming from a renewable source that you're growing it faster than you're burning it, right? If you're growing forests, cutting them down using pellets, and you're growing forests again, that can be good. I mean, that'll definitely be part of the mix. That's definitely renewable.
Yeah, of course, that was the main counter argument to these criticisms was that, but the point is not that it's a problem that it's still somewhat polluting. The issue is that how much better it is than the thing that we primarily were doing before. I think the more of an issue now is with the whole war situation, that there's this whole fuel thing
Yes.
problem. So people started firing up some like closed plants again, like coal plants and stuff to
Yeah.
compensate. But I guess who knows? Like if there is less of a fuel consumed because it's not being transmitted, I just heard that maybe the issue was that they were not sending it, but they were still burning it, and so something spiteful like that. Maybe that's that kind of issue. But
Yeah, I think
if you
so.
have just a situation where somehow the supply gets interrupted and people suddenly have issues with being like even heating in the winter, then what it probably means that I guess overall less energy is being used. So maybe that's in a way a weird positive.
Yeah,
It
it's
just
big energy.
just reminded me of one thing. It's just a silly joke thing. It's in Ukraine, but it's also in other Slavic languages like Czech. With all the nuclear war scare, nuclear attack scare, it's a bit unfortunate that their word for area, like a district in Ukrainian language, is oblast.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. Well, that being said, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I do have hope, and I'm excited that with enough people focused on it, again, it's comes down to subsidies. It comes down to trying to remove subsidies from old, dirtier ways and trying to support, the new technologies in a good, clean way, but being mindful of the recycling parts of the materials. So that's the second part. So we got food, we got energy, transportation. I want to touch on a little bit as well because I'm excited about this very much too. And it comes down to transportation as a service, TaaS. TaaS is the new big word for transportation. And it really comes down to rethinking how we get around the world in a way that, again, is sustainable, electric, renewable energy wise, and again, using materials that are easily recyclable. And part of it is the electric car, perhaps, but even more than that, it's the autonomous vehicle, where you can basically take 10 cars and reduce them and get the same amount of travel out of one car. Where you have 10 people all sharing the one
Of
car.
course, you can be using AI or algorithms to increase efficiencies further in a way that any human direct controlled solution wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, so we have the technology today, with enough, again, government support, government regulations to allow it, where you can have certain areas of certain towns completely automated.
I just wanted to point out that like it's one of the big issues with the either conservative or Malthusian arguments that are relevant to this discussion. The issue usually is a lack of imagination in like how much you can improve efficiencies of stuff. It's been I don't think I don't think we're anywhere near the ceiling of how much we can push or get out of the same amount of resources. I think we still have at least one order of magnitude more room to go as the technologies suggest. And a lot of it that's sort of unpleasant to conservatives is that maybe it would require them to make some lifestyle choices that even like seemingly wouldn't change anything at all other than in their mind. Like from now on, instead of eating meat that's made from animals, you will eat exactly the same meat, just synthesized. And that to them would be insurmountable problem, even though it wouldn't even like in terms of experience of eating the meat itself be in any way different. So there's a lot of subjective bottlenecks or factors in that. I think like I have an example for transportation. I think it was I've seen it in a documentary about maybe it was mentioned in the documentary about the biosphere, like the people who tried to create biosphere. Maybe there was a suggestion there. Maybe I heard it somewhere else. For international shipping, you could do sailboats. It's just that the only trade-off is, okay, it wouldn't be as fast. But in terms of energy, it would be incredibly more efficient / less wasteful. And you could do it. You could totally have like super, like I guess better than they were in the historical times, but you just like the best possible sailboats that you can make using science. And they will be just doing the shipping. And so instead of getting a thing in 2 days, you would just, okay, so I'll get it in a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's a subjective lifestyle adjustment that sadly many people wouldn't be able to make.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is you could possibly have solar boats. They're working on solar boats as well that have sails as well as an additional source. And even too, you can have autonomous shipping. And a good chunk of shipping is autonomous. You can have this huge ship with only a crew of 5 people.
Yeah, so you would have autonomous solar sails.
Autonomous solar sail shipping all around the world, and that is the end game, where you basically have hyperloops are also really cool. I don't know we talked much about hyperloops in the past, but
well, I have seen a lot of debunkings of hyperloop
we'll see.
by skeptics on the internet.
They're a long way to go, but long-term thinking, 50 years, 100 years out, I do think this is the way we're going to transport ourselves around the world. It's going to be electric,
I think the
maglev,
main issue was okay. So to
autonomous.
just to super quickly say the
Okay.
criticism. The criticism is like if you need to be traveling inside of a vacuum filled, well, filled is a oxymoron there.
Yeah.
In a vacuum tube, it's a bit of a unnecessary death trap. There's definitely no reason you couldn't have high-speed rail. That's the thing that you can totally have, and you can have tunnels like rail tunnels. That's not really the issue. I think the issue with Hyperloop specifically is that it's very difficult, or at least it really appears to be engineering wise, very difficult to have a long tubes in which you're maintaining vacuum.
Hmm.
That's the biggie. And
Yeah.
if you had like a rupture in the tube, then a shock wave basically of pressured air would be moving through the tube, and that wouldn't be great for
Yeah.
people inside of the tube.
No, it's
So
true.
there are engineering challenges. Let's put it that way.
They're definitely, and it's never a complete vacuum. I think it's like a 1%. So that small,
Well, but
holes
sure, like you
wouldn't
can't
blow it up.
realistically have complete vacuum. It's enough of a vacuum that you
Yeah.
can't breathe in it, and it's
No,
dramatically different pressure.
you're right. And they definitely have to have escape tubes and safety plans. And you're right. It may never come to fruition completely. Maybe we don't need to. If we can get high-speed electric rail everywhere in the world, and we can get
Yeah, because you can have
autonomous
that's the
cars
thing. You can
everywhere in
have
the world.
even like autonomous carriages on rail
Yeah, and
if you
that's the other
wanted
one
to
I
do
was going to
that.
mention. So there's something called kind of like we had rail cars through all the big cities. We had electric rail cars, and then what happened is the gas companies bought them all up and dismantled them so that they could sell more gas cars. And now we get around on buses that are gas powered. So if we could just kind of rethink that a little bit and convert all of our major cities back to just kind of electric rail transport, little buggies on rails that just autonomously run around the city. They don't need a driver. They're just going. And maybe they're 5 people per carriage, and they're just kind of constantly coming. You grab it and you kind of go high speed wherever you want to. Whenever you want to get off, you go off the
Yeah.
little off
You,
ramp.
you could build a little roller coaster if you wanted in the city.
Perhaps.
Also.
But the point is transportation shouldn't be something that we all have to have a car. And this is the transition we need to make.
Yeah.
Is that people love the freedom of the car, the freedom of the road. And we have to somehow move beyond that to the point where it's 10 times cheaper if we just share one autonomous car between 10 of us and maintain that car and let it drive all day instead of rusting in our driveway, most of the day. And that's the mental leap that I think we have to somehow push. We have to rethink what that means.
I have several thoughts on that I should say before I forget them. One of them is sort of hilarious that conservatism is an idea that things should probably stay the way they have been for a long time because that's more prudent course of action than anything new that you can come up with, probably. But many of the conservatives would, for instance, really love cars. And cars are a modern invention that didn't exist. And for the longest historical time, you couldn't possibly approach the speeds with which you can regularly drive in cars. And I guess then you could say, so horse is the traditional thing. Well, there have been whole civilization that didn't have horses. So because they evolved only on one continent and then later had to be spread to the other continents. So that didn't actually have any beast. I think South America didn't really have any beast of burden at all that you could have. I think llama was the best that they could do, something lame. So so that's like sort of one point of view is that this kind of change is completely in line with like what humans have been doing the whole history, have been changing how they transport, especially lately. That's one thing. Other thing is if you look at like the concerns for the future, how sort of unrealistic the projections will be if you assume things will remain the same, even like just generally. Is that do you know what the main concern was in big cities when before cars, when horse was the main form of transportation? What the problem in the future will be?
Oh, for horses, like the manure was a big problem.
Yeah. They thought that like if you had too many people, then we would need too many horses, so the manure would be everywhere. So poop the cities, and that will be the issue.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's interesting. So then in the future, for sure, that building big cities, mega cities are a huge part of the solution. We definitely want, better mega cities that get food on site, fully autonomous transportation. You can redesign them from the ground up if you need to, or just take the current subway systems and the current taxi systems and convert them all to 100% electric, autonomous, sustainable transport, where you get so much more bang for your buck. So anyway, there's a whole report on that. I'm excited about it. I really love autonomous cars. I've always loved them. I think they'll be at least 10 times, if not 99 times, or they'll be at least 10 times safer than human driving once we kind of get them out there. Yeah,
well,
you might know.
Another thing, but there's a dilemma. There's an ethical dilemma there, and that's why. Okay, so they will definitely result in fewer deaths if just figure out the algorithm to some scientific standard. Okay, but who will be responsible for the deaths that it will cause?
Yeah,
And
it's
some
going to
people
have
are
to be
very
the
uncomfortable
company.
with the idea
Yeah.
of a robot deciding as opposed to a human whether
You're
they're
right.
going to die or not.
That is a major ethical dilemma. If you have to swerve to avoid a baby, right, and you're going to kill the occupant of the vehicle, prioritize occupant, prioritize baby. That's a huge ethical dilemma we will have to solve. I don't know how we'll solve it, but that's again part of this discussion. That's one of the solutions we don't have a great answer to yet, but we will need to get it. And I kind of feel like we have to somehow trust the AI to stop. 99 times out of 100, they'll just be able to stop and keep both people safe.
Well,
The
but you're
one,
solving the situations where the problem doesn't arise. You need to have a
yeah,
solution for the situation when the problem does arise, however
yeah.
infrequently.
Exactly. And I think it's going to come down to each company to do it, and they'll have to have insurance, just like we have insurance today, that the company that provides the AI will have to pay for any damages or pay for any accidents. And yes, accidents will happen. You're still going to get that 1 in a million situation where you're going to hit a baby or you're going to hit a kid running across the road. But that happens today 10 times more. So you can't use it as an
Sure.
excuse not to do it, right?
Of
Because,
course.
a robot might kill a baby. Like right now, people are killing babies. And the robot will kill 10 times less babies. So let's, trust the robot at least a little bit to see
Yeah,
what it
let's
can do
give the
better.
robot a break.
Let's give the robot a break. Like no one's perfect. The robot's not perfect. We know it's not, but it's 10 times better than the current situation. So let's kill 10 times less babies by trusting the robot.
Sure. It's just that it's just what I'm saying. It is there definitely will have to be a particular legal solution. You just have to make a decision, like who makes the decision,
No,
and what the law will be.
Yeah, the company has to make the decision, and the companies that make better decisions more often will be more successful. And the company they have to be self-insured. The company
Not
that does it has to
necessarily. You
self-insure
would have
themselves.
also because whatever decision you make, if you leave it up to the company ultimately to decide the priorities for the algorithm, which is one of the possible solutions, then which is pretty sort of markets oriented, then I guess it could be fine with many people because then they could choose for ideological, philosophical reasons which of the company's software they want to be using or not, precisely
Exactly.
because what decisions it's wired to make.
Yeah. So capitalism, for the most part, works well for all of these transitions. So the point is, we just don't want to hold them back by saying, "Oh, I don't want to get an autonomous car," and try to ban them or try to put roadblocks up to try to keep them. Oh, they're not safe. One person died out of a 1,000. Let's get rid of all autonomous cars because they killed one person.
So just to sort of offer a criticism at this point, I think you're right that it works well enough, capitalism, in the sense that these are ways to solve those problems, and they are operating under market forces sufficiently to call it capitalism, but also to sort of see mathematically how it's going to achieve those efficiencies in the life. I think the main counter argument at this point, which sort of where it breaks into the sort of what you need to solve socially to help the world, is the whole billionaire issue. Is that the way it's set up right now, it's a few monopolies who will own all of these. Each of these particular systems will probably be owned by mostly or completely a monopoly, and one person or two people or three maybe will be making all of the decisions for those whole industries the way capital is working now, and that might be an issue because then you're running into these all are essential services. These are all things that people need to live. And if somebody has ultimately political control over pretty much the whole industry, well, you can look at something like Facebook and how it doesn't necessarily have great effects for personal freedoms and stuff.
That leads us to the fourth one, which is information. Materials are information. Another one. Information is kind of the last one, but it's the central one. And what you said exactly is we need a new organizing system. And that's what we really have to rethink all the organizing systems of the past based on democracy, whatever, socialism, communism, whatever ism you like. We're trying to rethink all of those and create a new one that works for these new
ism. That's definitely not going to be as terrible as all the new isms in the 20th
I always liked
century.
humanism myself. That's always been my favorite, but people read into that a little different way. But anyway,
which ism?
Humanism. The focus is human,
right.
And human society tries to save us from Armageddon.
But
in
you want to change human.
Yeah, a new way of
which
thinking about
humans are in
humanity.
those is humanism.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we need. We need new information systems that take all of these algorithms, all of these methods that make energy better, that make food better, make materials better, and make transportation better. And we have to find a way to almost democratize those information systems so that it's not controlled by the 1 in a trillion, and that we all have some say in how this world builds out, and that we all feel like a part of the world, and we're welcoming this great prosperous world and not kind of putting up roadblocks because we're scared, or we're
Well,
scared to lose
I'm
our freedom.
100% on board with the general sentiment there. It's just for me as a political scientist, all those scientific technological things we talked about, that's the easy part. The
Yeah.
political thing, that's the hard part.
Is hard. This is where we come in, though, Martin. This is our place here, is trying to figure out how these things work together and how we can give people a voice. On this Saving the World Together podcast, we are, trying to be the voice of the people in this matter, and we're trying to bring people together to figure out how we can make it work. How do we want our truth systems to work, our information systems to work, and how do we share IP, intellectual property, in a way that's fair, so that one monopoly doesn't control it all? And they talk about that a lot in the report. I can only kind of scratch the surface
I've
today.
noticed specifically the part about IP. I think I specifically noticed in their documentation.
I definitely feel like in the future we have to rethink the whole patent system to some extent. Maybe give 5 years or 10 years head start, and then just make it open, because then it keeps people moving forward, right? It keeps inventing new things, and it doesn't hold it back behind a wall. And you're continuously able to make things better once you open it up. So I like the whole idea of just short, brief patents that give people a little head start, some incentive to make things new, but then just sharing it, because we all benefit when we share ideas and share information.
I'm definitely a big proponent of open source wherever you can have it. But I do also understand that there are fields where there's some reason or rationale for incentive to the person who comes up with something to, like you say, to have some lead time or some sort of a time ahead of the competition that will inevitably arise.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm trying to think in these particular industries, because if you want to change laws, because ultimately what you need to do in terms of patents is that you will need to change laws, and laws, then you need to change them because it's an international issue, basically internationally, which means as different places as North America, even in America, between just Canada and United States, will be a very different issue. Or in places like European Union, and then if you have the technological patents, then there are whole countries like Russia or China, which very probably don't really respect the international rules in that regard a great deal anyway, necessarily. And what those kind of economies, especially China, would do if you started trying to do these transitions, is that it's definitely difficult. Like, it's something about the intellectual property. I think most people agree that what you don't want is somebody having like lifetime protection over a patent. It probably needs to be not that huge amount of time, but I don't think necessarily it's just about changing the amount of time. I think I just forgot what it specifically was, but I think in their proposal they had some sort of specific ideas in one of the proposals about how to change the approach to intellectual property.
That's definitely something we need to dig deeper on. We probably need a whole nother podcast on that alone, and maybe we can kind of dig deeper. But that's just something that they kind of talk about, that we have to think about solutions and we have to work together.
I just found it because I have the document open, the adapting intellectual property regimes. And what they say is to allow companies to patent production methods, but not biological entities, life, or genes. IP regimes should be process-focused rather than output-focused. I think that's their idea.
Right. That's exactly
one of their idea.
And yeah, I think that'll definitely take us in a good direction. So, yeah, and how that works worldwide, I think that you made a key point too, that any of this stuff, we kind of have to work together on it. And that's the whole point of the Saving the World Together concept, is that we are all in this world together. And we need to try to find systems, policies, laws, taxes that kind of work for all these corporations worldwide, so they don't just take their dirty stuff to one country, pollute it, and extract
I think
from it.
In this sense, China is not really the problem. I think China realizes they need to maximize the efficiencies. So every time you sell them an idea how to maximize efficiencies, they're likely to do it just because they have so many people and they need to take care of stuff. And they are facing sort of demographic collapse as well. So they will need to also try to automate a lot of work and not need as many workers. I think in the same direction as Japan went some time ago. So I don't think that's a big of a deal. Of course, right now, the main problem is going to be Russia, one way or the other. Also in big part because a lot of their economic might is selling natural gas and oil.
Yeah.
And or I think the similar sort of toxic actor for rational economic reasons is going to be maybe some of the Arab countries
Mm.
who Saudi Arabia, who own large oil reserves. I think those might be the countries that you might offer them some sort of a explanation or a deal of like how they are fitting into the future, because if
That's
everybody
exactly right.
just stops needing them, that's not great
Yeah.
for their plans in the future and stability in their world regions.
These are 100% the biggest discussions we need to have is how do we smoothly transition from the world that is, that, you know, to the world that we want with this creation-based mentality. And there's definitely going to have to be some subsidies, some buyouts, some kind of deals that get places like Russia and, you know, Middle East on board without them causing wars. And that might be one of the sources of the war in Ukraine. We don't know exactly what Putin was thinking about all this transitionary stuff. He's trying to stay relevant. He's scared that the world is changing so fast and that we're not going to need Russia's natural
No, it's
resources anymore.
definitely in places like Russia more so now, but China also to some extent, and probably some of the Arab countries also. It's that they sort of, because of either in selling oil and gas to everybody, or because of being a source of cheap labor for everybody, as it says. So it's like China is an oil or natural gas importer much more so than any sort of exporter. So they have a different way in which they manage it. But basically, the rest of the world tolerated their sort of inherent flaws and problems with their political and social situation because they were so sort of useful in some direct material sense. If Saudi Arabia wasn't a big source of oil, then for sure, like people in the United States would have a overall much bigger problem with what they're doing about a lot of things. Then now they sort of have to tolerate them. And the same it was, I think, with the Russian regime. I think just the Russian regime buckled first because they sort of, in compared to China, have some sort of similar looming problems in the future, which have a lot to do with demographics, the way I've heard it explained by analysts lately. And so it's like a big part of what they needed. Sort of realized, I think one of the explanations was that in terms of Russia, if you build your image in large part on the army that you have, and you have a demographic problem in that you won't have enough people to even field an army in the future of a sufficient size. If you sort of make the demographic calculations, then you realize that this is your last time in the foreseeable future in which you even theoretically have the power to do some sort of military show of force or a grab of things you need, which are resources and people and other things that you have calculated that you not going to have in the near future. So I think the situation, people put a lot of emphasis on just that the expansion of NATO and sort of the stated ideological, political, explicit reasons why like Putin was spooked. But I think in those regimes, they're spooked because of the economics of their future, much more so than any political gestures or whatever. So that's why just Russia calculated if they are going to act at all, they're going to act now. And offering them some sort of future is to the leadership and or to the people in those countries ideally is a thing to stabilize the only thing I think that can ultimately stabilize them other than their own utter collapse.
Yeah, and that's
and
not
sort of
a great point. And I think it's heartening in a way that some of the biggest PF factories are going into China right now. They're working on several foundational ones. And if we could kind of help them to be leaders in this new technology, you know, using the new types of foods to feed their massive population, and using the new types of energy to replace their natural gas. Leave the natural gas in the ground a little more. We'll still use some of it, but let's get you some new technologies that you can make money off and feed your people and find prosperity. And I think that's the greatest message of all of this. Is we don't have to fight anymore. We've got more than we need.
Sure.
Scarcity is not a problem.
But I think there's a reason why those countries that are the problem are mostly those with the legacy of communism, like those that were big in communism and wanted to be like world leaders in communism and so really committed to it. Which, like, as opposed to if you look at the former republics of the Soviet Union and of the Eastern Bloc have changed. Like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because communism wasn't really their own thing that they wanted to do, they quickly changed to the sort of Western model of doing things completely, like freely, voluntarily, and gladly in virtually all of the cases. So the problem is that the sort of countries with the big, powerful countries with the legacy of communism is that the whole philosophy of communism was that you can just focus on the material stuff, like the material prosperity, and that's enough. And you don't need political freedoms, and you don't really need a society that's a humane place to live. If you just like keep people fed and housed, and you give them work in terms of some sort of physical sense, like in a factory building tanks or whatever, then everybody, this is going to work out. The whole thing is just going to work out. And I think even China had to pivot. I think was smarter in pivoting toward more of the sort of capitalistic things, and more of like sort of global economic, sort of like shifting the conflict with other powers into the economic sphere from the strictly we have big military, we will beat you up sphere, where Russia kind of stayed. And so that's they were smarter than that, and that's why I think Russia is in much more trouble now than China. But Russia, both and China, I don't think they can just solve the technological side of things and necessarily be fine and not a source of problem internally for themselves and for the
Mm.
rest of the world, because I think that was the whole approach of the European Union led by the Germans, was that through the economic relations or like mutually technological exchange and or stuff like that, you can make peace between nations, and you can through that they will learn also to then adopt some of the more humane things. There was a feeling for a time that the opposite sort of than it looks now was true. That those countries, precisely because they are inhumane in some ways, have an edge over places like European Union or well the West generally. Now with what the Russia done, it seems more obvious and like sort of the cracks appearing in the sort of Chinese system with their sort of financial crisis and the effects of the natural crisis and the demographic crisis that they caused to be much worse than it needed to be. So politically, because of course, like bad political inhumane decisions that they sort of did. So it seems like they have sabotaged themselves by not having a public sphere, by being inhumane, by sort of one of the problems for Russia is like if you're an inhumane society, one of the things that's going to happen is that you will have a brain drain. You will have the greatest people in your country leaving to places where they have more personal freedom. That's the edge of like the liberty approach, is that the best people in terms of skill and ability and knowledge prefer, because they know that in any system they can have materially enough. What they would always logically prefer is to have a good material existence, which they can always manage if they just apply their talents, but also the liberties. And they always would also want to have the extra liberties. And I think the main reason why the Eastern Bloc even collapsed was that, like, look at the rock and roll and blue jeans and Coca-Cola and all the like cool, even like those are material things on surface. It's an expression of a material freedom that you have extra on top of just being fed and housed and having work. So I think like what it's the still is a challenge. Like you can't just, I think you can't just offer them technologies or trade or something material solution. I think there needs to be some way. I'm not entirely sure how to do it, but there needs to be some way in which their regimes, in order for the whole planet to become more stable and their regimes as well and prosperous, their regime to become more humane.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure how, like you can't, I don't think you can do it by dealing with the current leadership, because the current leadership in all those countries is very used to just being in control and always opting to just stamp down any opposition that they don't like and being extremely illiberal. And
Yeah.
I don't really think how, and they've also brainwashed what worked. They did brainwash their populations to such an extent that it's not even necessarily going to work by trying to reach out to the people, because they would just think you're Satan or something, or be still completely believing, because there's sort of it's a bit of a karma thing almost. Like if you've done such a series of unethical decisions, then you kinda have to go through a collapse.
Mm.
You've sort of like,
Right.
you've cut off yourself off from any peaceful, reasonable, pleasant, or at least not extremely unpleasant way of resolving the problems.
So let's just call it then maybe it's the battle of the tyrants, right? It's we talked a lot about how to control tyranny and how to overthrow them, how to overthrow tyrants. And it's really tricky when they've been in power for so long and they've got so many people around them that are keeping them in power.
Yeah, like for instance, you're gonna start talking about overthrowing them, and that's when they're starting the wars. So
Yeah.
just be
That,
careful.
that that's why Ukraine has happened, because I think Putin saw his grip on his society collapsing for whatever reason because of this rethink future. that he's decided he had to try to brainwash his people into thinking that the war was necessary, into pointing the enemy, creating an artificial enemy so that he can hold on to some semblance of power. And maybe Korea does that as well, in North Korea perhaps, where he basically makes the whole world an enemy and tries to brainwash these people into thinking he's God and he's the savior, and everyone else that's outside of North Korea is the enemy. And he tries to kind of redirect them. And anyone who doesn't believe that can just die. So believe that he's, so you can kind of see, China, North Korea, and Russia all have some parts of this where they've been in control for so long, for so many decades, and they're seeing cracks in their control, and they're just struggling to hold on to it because they know if the cracks break, they're all going to have their heads on pikes, right? So how do we somehow give them the incentive to buy them an island and let them go off into the sunset?
Well, that's the thing. Like again, Napoleon situation, just send them into exile. Historically, sending them into exile on some pleasant island was one of the ways that it was done. That's for sure. It's just that again, I'm not sure that the universe wants them to get out of it okay.
No, there needs to be a karmic representation. Yeah. So you might be right. There might just have to be some revolution to some extent in these countries, and we have to somehow empower them to get rid of their own leaders.
Because maybe you know what ultimately I'm arriving to what the big problem is for these regimes and the big difference between them and the West, like the one main big difference. I usually don't like to simplify things too much, but I think in this case it's deserved or legitimate. And that's if you are a tyrant, what you're doing primarily is destroying or eliminating any form of dissent. Anybody who criticizes you is the enemy and you're getting rid of them. That's not happening in the West. The main difference is in the West, anybody can criticize the leaders. That's the liberty. That's the political freedom. That's the main difference between these regimes. And the effect of that is that after a while of doing that, if you're doing it extremely enough, like you've jailed or executed or made to have an accidented everybody who disagree with you, then you think you're right about everything and you don't have any critical feedback on anything, and that's why you believe, oh, our army is great, it's definitely going to be a great time if we decide to go into another country to attack. The truth is the army could have been good, or as it turned out might have been corrupt and everything in it was stolen and not working and stuff, but you don't know, you couldn't possibly know that objectively if you've gotten rid of everybody who criticized anything that was wrong and then taught everybody to never say that something's wrong. And then you've completely lost error correction mechanism in the society. And that's why you've basically just determined that in some amount of time, could be random amount of time, or just statistically, eventually you will fail. Because you don't have a mechanism that will, if you're likely to fail in some way, that will prevent that failure. And in China, it's the same, and in Russia, it's the same. And I think that's the best advantage of the West. And I think if you want to save a society, then what you need to do ultimately is to somehow convince it or give it a mechanism to error correct. Because without it, it's just doomed.
I like it. And that's again, the greatest part of information is freedom of information, so that we can correct ourselves and we can find this new organizing society that's going to work with these new methods, with these new ways of creating energy, creating food, creating materials, and rethinking our current system. Current system of capitalism has a lot of great things going for it, like we said, but we definitely need to tweak it a little bit. We need to make sure that all the costs are accounted for, pollution and all the cycles of waste that are involved with capitalism, and all the slavery aspects of it, where you have maybe wage slavery or child labor. All those aspects of human freedom need to be accounted for somewhere. And that's where you need governments to kind of enact laws that have safety, fair wages perhaps, and then have fair wage laws worldwide, that you can't have people working for slave labor wages, and then of course the UBI, some kind of basic dividend for everyone worldwide. Maybe Russia or China would go for that. Maybe the Russian people, if we just offer them a worldwide UBI to be part of this worldwide system that profits from all these new technologies, and say, yes, we will give you food, technology, we'll give you a certain basic stipend, but you have to give up your army, or you have to give up your pirate.
Then the tyrant is the obstacle, because the tyrant wouldn't want to have his country helped even by forces from the outside, because that also delegitimizes him.
Right. But maybe we can give their population enough information that they can dethrone their own tyrant and that they can
Well,
revolt
yeah,
against their
that's
tyrant.
again, okay. Just talking seriously, of course, that some people are talking about is that they're sort of waiting for the Russian people to overthrow Putin. It's just there are a few snags in this sort of idea. Not that it's impossible. Of course, historically, one of the ways you can make a transition of regime happen is when there's a popular uprising against the leadership. The issues with that are you are still kind of likely that the new person that's put in charge will be a different kind of tyrant that's functionally the same as
Yeah.
the previous guy. And I'm saying guy because it's not going to be a woman, it's going to be a guy. So in that sense, it's not really necessarily like a solution or with a high probability of working is
Mhm.
the issue with this approach, especially if you're just waiting for the people to like if they had the capacity to do it, if the population in the country had this willpower and capacity to do something like that and were organized in any capacity, then they would have done it already, probably a long time ago or at least lately. If since it didn't happen, then what you could like maybe hope for is like if you look at I guess what's the other sort of group of people hopes for is that as it was with Hitler, that they would just lose, that they will lose the war and they will basically capitulate, and then an outside power, which could have somewhat benevolent intentions even, would sort of help in the transition. And but then the issue is that like the whatever would be put into power there would look like a puppet inherently of some outside forces. And if you have a very
Yeah.
proud population, nationalistic proud population, then that's a different problem that it may not be accepted even if sort of the transition was somehow enforced. Not to mention that pushing a nuclear power to fail to lose a war is very dangerous because they can just say fuck it and just
Yeah. No,
fire
you're right.
all the nukes.
You're right.
So
You're right.
it's so hard. It's so much easier if it's not a nuclear power. It's a really big and important country.
Yeah.
Because if it was in the Balkans, it was Serbia. You can just like the NATO can just waltz into Serbia, basically bomb it, make it lose the war, and then dethrone the leader of the country and force there to be for there to be democratic elections. Like you can like the best you can try to force is a legitimate democratic election. It's just the issue is that in this scenario, again, the proud nationalistic brainwashed Russian people, the majority of them who still left there somehow, because everybody who disagreed is out or dead of the country pretty much, who could have left. So it's guaranteed that even in a fair democratic election, the person elected would be just another iteration of the problem. Because it's like there's so many people who are so well brainwashed, who are just so wrong of mind at this point in this country that again, I'm just keep getting back to the notion of karma. That
Mm.
there's just some sort of a collective karma that they're under the effect of now that has to play itself out because only in their individual cases would be like very many people would have to make a radical personal decision to endanger themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not something that is easy to hope for.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head, but it does come back to information and getting the right information to the right people, and that's where the World Wide Web can help, and that's where some of this rethink technology stuff can help with the whole information sharing IP, sharing ideas, sharing new ways of functioning society, new ways of organizing society, and definitely, I think that the Russian people eventually might take decades, might take a century, but eventually they will come across the same thing that the West has seen, that information grows, information helps, and more information is better rather than restricting information and
Sure,
brainwashing people.
or their karma can cause them to become something like North Korea for 100 years.
Yeah, that would be sad. You're right, that might happen, and I think we need to do our very best from the saving the world together perspective to get Russian people involved. We need to get some Russian people involved in this effort somehow, and help them spread this message to their own people,
Well,
word of mouth
because
style,
that's the
however
thing.
they need to.
Karma wise, that's how you're supposed to karmically learn. You have been apolitical your whole life. You let bad people run the country. You didn't, when it was still possible, you didn't complain. You didn't criticize them. You didn't dissent.
Yeah.
And you just thought that, oh, it's never going to be my problem. And then it suddenly, there's a mobilization, and it suddenly becomes your problem, and your life is on the line. And that's sort of the teachable moment for
Yeah.
the person who's been making the wrong choice their whole life. That's like the karma catching up to them. It's just
Well,
the issue is like in global politics is any individual person can then have a personal transformation, just realize they've been wrong and change their ways. Anybody can do it. It's just for a country to be saved, a huge number of people at the same time would have to make the right call in that situation. And that's historically not very frequent in terms of how often it happens.
You're right. It's likely going to end in some kind of end of the war. Either Russia just loses and he has to go back with his tail between his legs, and then maybe he gets overthrown by his own people because he lost the war and he loses his face, and they don't believe in him anymore. And then maybe somebody who is anti-Putin somehow gets power. We'll see.
Well, but that's the thing. I think the most realistic scenario is that somebody other who's functionally similar to Putin will replace Putin.
Yeah.
And maybe the correction will be like, okay, we're not going to be doing wars of expansionism now. Like, it could be better. It could be like have many things going for it, but I don't think there's any chance of like fundamentally different kind of leadership arising.
You might be right, but we can still hope. We can still push for it. I think it's still worth working for. And this whole Rethink Humanity movement, I think, applies anywhere, and it can apply in tyrannies. It can apply anywhere in the world. And it really just comes down to, again, just proving that it works, proving that technology is good for society, that it eliminates scarcity, it eliminates, hunger, it eliminates all these problems that we've been dealing with for centuries.
Yeah, well, it's just sad that we still have to kind of even try to prove that much, because that part should be just duh. It's just the only part that's supposed to be difficult is the political part, meaning like what kind of people do we want to be socially, not the part of like science obviously works. Duh.
You're right. But that's part of this rethinking the past, and information is such a huge part of that. The TruthWorks movement, I think, can really help a lot. And also just any kind of freedom of information, freedom of exchange. The fact that me and you can talk for a year on the other sides of the world, and I'm hoping someday I'll find someone in Russia just like you that can talk to me and help me understand from their perspective how we get through to the Russian people, to see that there's a better way. We don't need to hate each other. We can work together. Like, my best friends on the other side of the world have never been in the same country as him, and and we were able to connect in ways that we never had before. And I want everyone in the world to have that opportunity.
Sure. There's all kinds of potential thanks to technology to be used in ways that help. It's just particularly with internet, it's sort of sad how lately it's been used in ways in which it didn't help, or like made things worse, which is completely unnecessary because it's a technology that was specifically invented to help, and it can help.
Yes. And I think maybe even worldwide internet, like free internet worldwide, would be cool. If it was available anywhere in the world, satellite based, where anyone in Russia could just log on to the free internet, get whatever news source they want, or China as well, maybe.
I think that's like the main area, actually. I was sort of skeptical of some of the projects of Elon Musk specifically, even though, of course, that the cars work, and it's like there's some parts of the things he does that are just fine. Some of them are more questionable, like the Hyperloop, based on what analysis that I've heard. But with the sort of the internet using the satellites thing that you can bring to everywhere in the world, I think that even if you, of course, would be doing it for personal profit or whatever, it's one of the ways in which can build an infrastructure that is helpful. That's just can be a good thing.
I think so. And that's again one of the big 5 points, is getting information out to the people. Okay, I think I want to just wrap it up there. So we talked about energy, solar, wind, batteries. We talked about transportation as a service. Super excited. Precision fermentation foods, freedom of information, freedom of sharing, better IP laws, information, and then materials, which basically help create nanomaterials, 3D printing, structure, shelter, clothing, all in sustainable, environmentally friendly ways. We're getting better and better at managing materials for all of these processes, which is great. And so all 5 of these things are converging in a way, just like the iPhone was the smartphone, kind of was the smart screen, the batteries, and everything. You were able to create all of this, a computer and a phone, for the first time in history because of all this convergence of technologies. So we see now these 5 converging areas of technologies giving us at one point this kind of singularity event that changes humanity as we know it, and gives us all the freedom from scarcity, the freedom from tyrants, if we will, if we're able to maybe have open borders at some point in the near future because of this great technology. We're able to have transportation all around the world in an easy way.
Sure, I just would just stop you a little bit there. There's going to be some security concerns if you have advanced technologies available to many people, but That's basically what Star Trek is exploring. Is like this sort of dichotomy of like, yeah, we can individual people can do a lot of damage.
Hmm.
So how do we have a society where that doesn't usually occur?
Yeah. You still need police forces. You still need some form of surveillance. Surveillance is our god right now. You know, we used to have religion and God that kept people in line. Now we have surveillance technologies. We have iPhones. We have
Yeah, because
phones.
there literally now is something that knows everything you've done.
Yeah, you know, Google can keep us safe if we implement it in the right way. AI can keep us safe to some extent if we keep it in the right way. So there are methods. There's methods that we can use to keep people safe and keep moving forward. And just definitely rethinking about it and thinking about what works for us, what kind of society we want to build is really what we're all about here. And that's why I really highly recommend this report to anybody that wants to think about the future, rethinking what role you have, what role we personally have in building this future, and trying to kind of avoid the roadblocks, avoid the, you know, the barriers, the Luddite fallacies, all these kind of conservative mind frames at the same time of just trying to tweak them a little bit. We don't have to give up everything. We can still hold on to our basic morals and our religions and all these things that we love, but we can kind of just tweak our acceptance a little bit of what we want to build and what kind of society we want to build. Rethinking a little bit about how we structure our corporations, how we structure our governments, and how we structure our information. So very enlightening for me. It was wonderful to read. Glad we could talk about it today. We basically kind of just scratched the surface. We talked for almost 2 hours. This was great though, and it's just great for me to kind of make sense of it and get Martin's feedback. So thanks so much for being with us today. Martin, do you have any final comments or anything else you'd like to talk about today as far as this whole RethinkX, Rethink Humanity discussion?
Like I said, I just think that people have a lot of potential to adapt to new realities and always have. So I think we should try to conserve that.
I like that. That's a great thought to think of. Conserving humanity while rethinking humanity at the same time, and pushing forward to the future, but still holding on to what we love most about family, friendships, and all the great things that make being human such an exciting thing. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us, Saving the World Together podcast, and let's save the world together.